Round 2, we discover how students learn from each other as well as from their teachers in No School Today.
George was kind of like his father.
These students all have one thing in common. They're expressing their knowledge and their ideas. Communication is the key word, with students using their communication skills in a variety of ways. Gestures, expressions, and of course languages are all ways of communicating. Languages are an important part of the junior certificate curriculum, and one of the aims is that students acquire the ability to communicate through language learning. It's all about learning together and sharing experiences through a shared language. Even activities like debating can help this process. Students not only expressing themselves, but also gaining the confidence and skills necessary to take them through life after school. Hello and welcome again to No School Today. In this programme, Learning Together, we'll be looking at the changing role of the teacher in the classroom and at how students are now much more actively involved in their own learning, particularly in the learning of languages. With me is Jim Callan of St Patrick's College Maynooth, Director of the Schools for Active Learning programme, and John Bean, language teacher at Hartstown Community School in Dublin. They'll be talking to me later, but first we'll have some views on new approaches to teaching and learning in schools.
The biggest change for the better in the teaching of modern languages, in my opinion, from what I've seen in schools, is pupils' exposure to the spoken language. When I joined the inspectorate in 1982, when I went into classrooms, I normally spoke French to pupils, and there was relative unease with the business of somebody that they hadn't seen before speaking French to them. There is no unease now.
They now see the language as a living thing, a medium through which they can express themselves, a medium through which they can enjoy themselves, and also something that enriches them as people and in their development and in the whole area of cultural awareness.
If a communicative approach is to be used, then you have got to radically transform the normal process within the classroom. Research indicates quite clearly that teachers do roughly 60 to 80% of the talking. The more traditional the type of classroom is, the higher that figure is likely to be. Therefore, the opportunity for pupils to contribute in that sort of traditional format is fairly restricted. So, if pupils are to develop a genuine opportunity, or to have a genuine opportunity to communicate, then you need to use the sort of communicative techniques which will allow that to take place.
I think there's more language learning. There's a healthier language learning. Before they were learning for exams. They were learning how to talk about characters in a book or in a poem, other people's feelings. Now they're learning how to talk about themselves and to talk about themselves.
Teachers must be aware of the tendency for girls to stand back, to be more passive. And this is not an innate, I hasten to add, this is a learned activity. It's learned by girls to be more passive. Some girls, of course, are not. But by and large, you find in mixed class situation that the boys tend to dominate. They tend to demand more of the attention of the teacher, and the teacher tends to give more time to the boys. Unwittingly, I would think.
I would be very careful to make sure that I would draw into the work of the group those students who, because they're shyer or they're not yet certain that what they've got to say is worth saying, that I would give them the opportunity to speak. And so I would address comments specifically to some students, knowing that if I didn't, the stronger, more vociferous students would dominate the group. So if you're aware that they're there in the group and you work out a strategy to involve them, then I think it's tremendous for them, because they feel successful when their story is read and everybody else says how good it was. It was their story too.
I have a slight fear myself that in some way the teacher is being asked almost to entertain the class. And that because our young people today are a generation that are an audiovisual generation, and that in fact you have to make an instant impact. In fact, they're a generation that talk a lot about experience. But in my own experience of young people, I think they're not always in touch with a lot of what they experience. That in fact, you equally have to help them to stop, to think and reflect. My worry about an overly active participative methodology is, I wonder, will there be quiet time? Will there be reflective time? Will there be research time where the young person is following up the initial interest or the initial opening up of a subject and really going down the route in a much more intensive way?
Jim, from what was said there, individuals participating in their own learning and group interaction, are they the best possible methods of learning? Have we got it right this time?
Well, they are part of a range of methods that can be used. And I think it is right that pupils participate in their learning, and it is right that we do so in groups. These type of methods, for example, do give pupils an opportunity to experience different ways of teaching a subject. And I think that in itself is worthwhile. Also, I think by participating in it, they get to know the subject and aspects of the, if you like, the ways in which knowledge is gathered in a subject, the way in which a subject is used, or the knowledge in a subject and the experience in a subject are used. Methods like, for example, field work in geography, project work in history and other subjects, role play and drama in areas like, say, language, whether it's English or Irish or French.
Well, John, you're the person who puts them into practice every day in the classroom. What are the realities, practically, of such energetic forms of methods?
I think for the teacher, firstly, it can be very tiring. Noise levels can increase in the classroom as well. And then, of course, there's the question of space and how you organise your classroom, if it's possible to do it in the first place. But I think the advantages for the students are that because they're actively involved in what they're doing, they have to take more of an interest. I think the learning is more effective. And it's more enjoyable, generally, much more enjoyable.
I imagine it demands a lot of pre-preparation time for you.
You've got to be sure that you know what you're doing before you start, and that explain clearly to the students what the activity is, where the start is, where the end is, and what they're supposed to get from it.
Role play and drama that Jim mentioned there, I'm just wondering, Sister Pat Murray said earlier that she worries about teachers ending up entertaining rather than teaching. Do you think there might be a danger of that?
Well, I don't see anything wrong with a class being entertaining. Now, whether a role is simply entertainers, that's not the right way to go. But role play, drama, as Jim has said, they're all vital and they're all part of life, and they have to be part of the syllabus. But they're only part of it. There are other things as well. There are quieter moments in a classroom. There are disciplined moments in a classroom. Silent reading, writing on their own, and whatever work they may do at home at other stages. It's not all but active and running around and group work or what looks like unstructured fun.
Let's have a look now at some schools, beginning with St. Joseph's Secondary School in Navan.
We've been talking a lot about stories over this week, haven't we?
Yes.
Can you remember what we said is the first thing you have to have in a story? Let me remember what it was. A character. Okay, being involved in some kind of creative process is going to help them develop a sympathy for the writers that we will eventually go on to study. They'll have some sense of what's involved in the creative process, having to find characters, having to find a setting, somehow making their character attractive to a reader.
Well, not only that, but just if they're different, kind of.
They have to be different. Different from whom?
From ordinary people.
From ordinary people. You wouldn't like to read about ordinary people?
Well, I don't mind, but just the main character should be interesting.
You want the main character to be a little different. Yeah. Okay, all right. Does anybody else agree with that? I think the main character has to be somehow different. Yeah. Tina, why don't you?
The main character should be just an ordinary person, like Glen Rowe. That's ordinary.
Glen
but like
Rowe.
Home and Away isn't. Like Home and Away wouldn't really happen. It might in Australia, but like Glen Rowe is something that would happen in Ireland.
Something that would happen in Ireland.
It's everyday life. It's not. Yeah. You know, it's not made up.
Okay, somebody you imagine they live the same life you do.
Yeah.
Or, Trina was saying, somebody who's a little bit different. They have to be interesting, exciting, maybe mischievous. And you said something else as well towards the end. What did you say? Mischievous, curious, and something else. What did you say? Can you remember? Somebody different. They have to be not boring. Yes. A lot of ordinary people could be boring though, couldn't they?
Yeah.
So you have to be very careful if you're writing about an ordinary person that they're not boring. What could happen to them that would mean that an ordinary person isn't boring anymore?
Something has to happen. Like there has to be a story to it, like that makes the character interesting.
So something has to happen that makes
Yeah.
the character interesting.
Because like if you're not going to be reading a book, oh I went to school, I got my breakfast, that type of thing. You want something that you're going to say, oh I want to read that, you know. So you don't want to be bored by what you're reading.
Okay, now what kind of things could happen to ordinary people that would be interesting for me to hear about?
Win the lotto.
They might win the lotto. That would make them interesting suddenly.
Yeah, like people might respect them a bit more. You know, they'd have money.
But that's true, isn't it? The world works a bit like that. If I had won £1 million on the lotto last night,
I'm at CBBS, friends.
I wouldn't be here this morning. Although we were always conscious of the 4 main skills, reading, writing, speaking and listening, now we're making a special effort to focus on speaking and listening, which are really the way that most people function in terms of English. And so we're allowing students to succeed at something they're well able to do.
When she was 7 months pregnant,
It was his property that she was on. And
yeah, it was it was his fault, and he probably felt that he shouldn't have gone on the business trip. He should have just postponed it for a couple of weeks or something.
Right from when I met them in September, we've worked very carefully to create an atmosphere in the class where the students are free to speak. And I would say to them during a lesson that there are no right answers and that everybody's entitled to say what they want to say. Very often that puts me in a position where I have to deal with a comment that might be off the point, but we can bring it around. It's a valid comment. It's where the student thinks the story is happening.
Irene was working in the shop. It was a bright, small, square room with red lino on the floor. A brown counter ran around the back of the shop. Its shelves were packed with food and magazines. Irene didn't enjoy working here at 7 months pregnant. There was a small storeroom at the back with a poorly lit light. At the wall, a sink was squeezed into the room. Here the kettle and mugs were stored for Irene's mid-morning break.
It's the cold, dreary, stormy night as Bella closed the curtains in the warm, bright nursery. Behind her she could hear the quiet snuffling of the twins who were in her care. Bella took care of these children several hours a day and she loved them as if they were her own.
It was a Friday evening. Customers strolled around the elegant boutique fingering the silk finery. Louise swept around offering quiet words of advice to her wealthy customers. The boutique was decorated with autumn colours. In a corner sat a mischievous 18-month-old baby pulling fur coats off their hangers and tumbling around in the fluffy coats.
An Táimid chun an tionscanmh sin dhéanamh, bhí muidir caint an teach caite faoi tionscanmh a dhéanamh conas gur féidir linn ard scoil intan a thaispáint a scoilna eile. A bhrín, ceiste gutsa? Sport. Today they have suggested various topics, clothes they would wear at the weekends, clothes that they wear for sport. They've decided to introduce their school to another school. And to that end they have examined the different topics that are relevant to their school life. They may not be the same for ourselves, but I think it's important that the teacher focuses on what the children want to talk about, and then they're prepared to learn. I'm amazed to see that they have actually decided themselves how to go about doing this work. I asked them to choose a taoiseach, a group leader, whose job it is to monitor the work, make sure everybody is working, that they're not doing similar tasks, and also it's up to him to give them homework. I think a little bit of autonomy there is important. While I'm spás an sin, but now shul team, right?
Tá misig déan faoi consoles.
Consoles? What is sin?
Tá si sort river.
Sort rivery, come on.
Tá.
Bhí misig déan na cluichí bíonn go out.
Aaron River, right. Rock me trust an group of Seanish. Agus cad a bheith sibh sé Jennifer?
Ceol.
Bheith sibh Jennifer ceol, right.
Ceol eile.
Okay, ceol eile. Alternative yna. Sin ceol eile, mai here. I'm not. teacher as such during this. I'm going around from group to group guiding. They'll ask me from time to time, is this the Irish for something, or how do you spell something in Irish? And the whole exercise is to be carried out as Gaeilge. But from time to time, they won't know the word for maybe a documentary, so they can say, on my lat documentaries, or something like this. But they're doing surveys themselves. I see them drawing out questionnaires, and they're going around from group to group. It's all as Gaeilge, though. That's the important thing. And they can have as much fun as they like within that. Now the boys are learning how to speak Irish, and they'll have that for life. They're not learning for an exam, they're learning for communication, which will last forever, I find. Communication first, grammar perfection later.
Sure. Soccer.
It's an easier method of teaching. It's much easier. Okay, you have a lot more preparation to do, but when you've done it with a few groups, you can do the same thing with another group, and you learn as you go along. It's a new start, so there's a lot of new preparation. I have great crack with them sometimes too, and we slag each other, and it's all as Gaeilge, and they do love it, and that for me makes teaching easy.
Moi, ça va aussi. Les devoirs, alors, page 62. Do you notice anything different about this letter to what an Irish person might have written, about the layout of it? Daniel, what do you notice?
The address on the top.
The address is on the top. What about the address? Did we not write address?
It's on the other side.
Pardon?
It's on the other side.
Okay, so it's on this side. L'adresse est là. They're learning how to write a letter in French, and they're doing it really by discovering how it's done rather than by me telling them. They were given an example of the letter, and they went home and looked at it, and then they spotted the differences. Then we move on to using the letter for comprehension. Methods, I suppose, would be some of the ones in the activities whereby they've got to communicate with each other. The tasks have to become interesting, so that the grammar or the learning of vocabulary isn't an end in itself, but that they want to learn them in order to do some of the tasks. And that's why when they're telling each other's horoscopes, or when they're racing each other on the board, all of this is given a reason, I suppose, for wanting to learn the language. We learnt a few words the other day how to describe people, didn't we? Some of them nice words, and some of them not so nice. Okay, so now let the fortune tellers come out on a 2 minutes to tell each other's character, okay? And we want to read the hands now as well so that we know. Allez-y.
No. Oui.
To a gourmand.
Oui.
By second year, most of these kids will understand all that I might need to say to them in French, even down to understanding explanations of grammar. I don't like to use more French than they can understand because it's a mixed ability class. Some people will work it out faster than others, and I don't want the French to be a block to communication. It has to be the means of communication, but it can't be a block. So I won't use French if I think they won't understand me. Now, have a little race between the tables, okay? Allez-y, go! I want them to enjoy speaking French and to think that it's fun, that language learning isn't a chore, and the fun from language comes with what you can do with it when you have it learned. I want them then to feel that they can meet a French person on the street here, talk French to them, or they can go to France and have no fear when they get there. They can understand and they can communicate. Écoutez. Listen. Yeah. I think these children will go to France and they'll find very quickly that they'll be able to communicate with French people in authentic situations. That's what the course is about now. How would you use that in a sentence, let's say? When they go to college as well, even if they don't study French as a degree subject, more and more courses include French or German or language modules. It makes people mobile. For holidays as well, just going abroad, the fear is gone. I think it's much more fun to be able to go with some of the language.
John, I remember that class very well. I don't think I have ever in my life seen French verbs made exciting or so exciting as they were there. But tell me, are you convinced that methods like that are actually, you know, good for learning, better for learning than the old methods of learning off texts, watches of vocabulary?
Well, really, I suppose what we were doing there is the same as we were doing maybe 20 years ago. The object was to learn the verbs. They've got to be done. And maybe there's some of the more painful elements of language learning. That's maybe doing it just a little more, with a little more fun and a little more crack, if you like. There's still the other things to be done, like reading and texts. But yes, I am convinced that this helps the children to be more interested in what they're doing.
Well, John's convinced, Jim, as a teacher, but what about the parents? I wonder if parents are convinced that these communicative methods of language learning are in fact as good as the old rote learning. What have you found? You have a lot of contact with groups and different schools. What's the reaction been back from parents?
I think that there's a sense in which parents perhaps may not be quite as familiar with what is happening in the new junior certificate as perhaps one would wish them to be. One picks up from teachers concerns like, well, we have to provide homework for the pupils, and if we don't have the homework for them, then perhaps we're not doing any work at all.
But now they would need homework, wouldn't they?
They would, but
not all,
but not all the time. Of course it does, and I think that, but nonetheless, there are points, particularly perhaps in language teaching, such as John is doing. I think that there will be points early on in learning a language when perhaps it's not appropriate to assign work until after a certain period of time, when certain features of the language or certain aspects of the language is learned, then to assign homework. And I think there may be a point when parents, and one can understand it, may be wondering, well, what really is going on there? Is it all fun and games? But in fact, as John said, no, it's built into a procedure of learning through fun, through participation, acquiring the skills of the language.
And it's every bit as good, if not better, than the old rote learning.
Well, I think that rote learning has a place, and I don't think one is saying it's either this or that. I think that in any learning situation, what one is looking for are a variety of approaches. You do need to sit down and rote learn certain aspects of any subject. You have to sit down and you have to acquire certain knowledge. But I think what we're about here is engaging in new, or not new, but diverse approaches to learning.
Well, John, you're convinced as a teacher, and certainly the students really enjoy it, and they've learned. They were very new students. They'd only been doing French for less than 12 weeks, if I remember at the time. 10 or 11 weeks, and they were first years. What about the parents? What kind of reaction do you get from your parents?
Well, positive reaction. If the students are happy in the classroom, then the parents are happy. And if it's seen that they're making progress, you can't really ask for much more. Keep them happy and making progress, and they'll do well in their exams as well, hopefully, at the end of the day. I think most parents are happy with that.
Right. Now, you were the only teacher in those three classes who had boys and girls in the classroom, and there were comments earlier on in the programme that boys in a class demand and get much more attention from the teacher. Do you find this is so?
They do demand more attention, and you've got to be aware, if you're teaching a mixed class, that you may be giving them more than their fair share, and encourage the girls to be more active. I think the group work can do that. Reuben mentioned in his class about picking a Taoiseach for each group, and certainly I would have a group secretary or a spokesperson and rotate that job around the group with every task, so that the same person is not always doing the same job or always taking over and directing the group.
Jim, you're involved in schools for active learning, so you're looking at groups, whether it be groups of girls, groups of boys, or mixed groups. What's your reaction to what John has said? Would you have anything to add to that?
Well, yes, I think group work is very important. I think that what you see in group work, you saw it in John's class and some of the other classes, that pupils do have an ability to take seriously the work that is on hand. They are capable of taking responsibility in the learning process. They are capable of sharing ideas and of generating within their own groups, under the guidance, of course, of the teacher, standards of work. And one could see that coming through.
Right. What about the problems of the boys, you know, being very pushy, demanding more attention, and the difficulties for teachers in making sure the girls get enough attention?
I think any kind of group work, whether one is talking about, you know, whether it's some boys getting in there rather than girls, whether it is the issue around group work, are people working, are they, you know, are they just chatting or talking? I think any of this group work, and it was mentioned, I think, by Reuben as well, requires very good preparation. In fact, classes of this nature require a lot of preparation. They need structure, they need direction. And I think the teacher, when preparing the work, has to look at so many facets of it, contributions from different people, structure of work, meaningful participation from everybody. But that takes good preparation.
Well, there are many facets and, as you say, a lot of direction there. We'll be coming back to some of those issues in future programmes. That's it for this programme. Next week's programme is called Exploring Solutions, and it's all about solving problems and thinking logically. Don't forget to join us for that.